You already know what you should be doing. That's not the problem. The problem is what happens in the moment you try to do it. You sit down, you open the file, you tell yourself this time will be different. And then something shifts, not dramatically, not in a way you can point to or explain. Just enough hesitation to check something first, just enough resistance to delay starting, just enough discomfort to make something else feel easier. And before you realize what's happening, you're gone. Not physically, but mentally, you've already left the thing that mattered. You're scrolling. You're reorganizing something irrelevant. You're thinking about starting instead of actually starting. And the strangest part is, it doesn't even feel like a decision. It feels automatic. So you do what most people do. You try to explain it. You tell yourself a story that makes the pattern make sense. You say you're lazy, that you lack discipline, that if you just tried harder, pushed more, forced yourself through it, things would change. Because what else could it be? You have the goals. You have the awareness. You even have those moments where everything becomes painfully clear. Late at night, after wasting another day, after seeing someone else doing what you said you would do, in those moments, you see it. The gap between who you are and who you know you could be. And for a while, that clarity feels powerful. You make plans. You set rules. You decide that starting tomorrow, everything changes. You'll wake up earlier. You'll stay focused. You'll finally become consistent. And sometimes for a few days, it works. You feel in control. You feel like you've figured something out. Like this is the version of you that was always supposed to exist. And then quietly it slips. Not all at once, just small compromises. You skip one day. You delay one task. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. And then it happens again and again, until you're back exactly where you started. Same habits, same patterns, same frustration. At that point, the story gets stronger, because now you have evidence, not just one failure, a pattern of them. You've tried before. You've failed before. So the conclusion feels obvious. This is just who you are. And that belief is what makes this so difficult to escape. Because once you start seeing your behavior as identity, every failed attempt becomes proof. Every delay becomes confirmation. Every moment of avoidance reinforces the same quiet idea that something about you just doesn't work. But here's the part nobody tells you. The part that changes how all of this fits together. The pattern you're trapped in is not random. It's not a lack of discipline. And it's definitely not a reflection of your potential. Because if it were, it wouldn't be this consistent. It wouldn't follow the same structure. It wouldn't show up at the same moments, in the same ways, over and over again. What you're experiencing is not chaos. It's a system. A precise, repeatable pattern that runs whether you understand it or not. And the reason it feels so confusing is because you're only seeing the surface of it. You're seeing the moment you stop, the moment you avoid, the moment you sabotage yourself. But by the time you notice that moment, the real decision has already been made. Quietly, automatically, somewhere below the level of your awareness. Which is why it feels like you're working against yourself. Because in a very real way you are. There is a part of you that wants to move forward, to grow, to build something, to become someone different from who you are right now. And there is another part that steps in at the exact moment that progress becomes real and pulls you back. Not violently, not in a way that forces you to stop, but in a way that redirects you. Softly, effortlessly, almost convincingly. And because that second part doesn't feel like resistance, it feels like you don't question it. You follow it. That's the illusion, that this is one unified system. That your thoughts, your decisions, your actions are all aligned. They're not. And until you see that clearly, you will keep trying to fix the wrong problem. Because what you're calling self-sabotage is not what it looks like. It's not you destroying your progress for no reason. It's not you lacking something that other people have. It's something much more structured than that. Something that has a purpose. Something that, in its own way, is trying to help you. And that's where this starts to get uncomfortable. Because if that's true, then the behavior you've been fighting is not the enemy. It's a response to something you haven't fully seen yet. And until you understand what that is, you can try as hard as you want. You can force yourself, discipline yourself, motivate yourself, and you'll still end up in the same place because you're trying to override something without understanding why it's there in the first place. And once you start looking at it that way, something shifts. Not in your behavior yet, but in how you interpret it. Because instead of asking, why can't I just do what I'm supposed to do? A different question starts to form. Quieter, more precise, and far more uncomfortable. What is this behavior actually doing for me? At first, that question doesn't make sense, because from where you're standing, there's no benefit. No upside to delaying your work. No advantage to avoiding the things that matter. No reward in watching your own potential sit unused. So the mind rejects the question. It goes back to what feels obvious. Laziness, discipline, lack of consistency. But if you stay with it, if you don't immediately escape back into that explanation, you start to notice something. The pattern isn't random. It doesn't happen all the time. It happens at specific moments, right before you begin something important, right when the stakes become real, right when there's a possibility of being judged, even if that judgment is only coming from you. That's when it shows up, not before, not after. Exactly at the point where action turns into exposure, and that detail changes everything, because it tells you something precise. This isn't about effort, it's about threat, not physical threat, something more subtle, something the brain treats just as seriously. The risk of failure, the possibility of not being good enough, the chance that you might try fully honestly and still fall short. That's the moment the system responds to. Because from the outside, starting a project looks simple. You sit down and begin. But from the inside, starting is a declaration. It means this matters. This reflects me. This is something I'm willing to be judged on. And the moment you cross that line, the outcome becomes real. Before that, everything is safe. Ideas are safe. Plans are safe. Potential is safe. Because none of it has been tested. But the second you act, that safety disappears. Now there's something to measure. Something that can succeed or fail. And this is where the system intervenes. Not to destroy your progress, but to protect you from what that progress might reveal. So instead of stopping you directly, it redirects you. It gives you just enough friction to step away, just enough resistance to delay, just enough distraction to make something else feel more important. And because it doesn't feel like fear, it doesn't feel like protection, you don't recognize it for what it is. It feels like, I'll start later. I'm not in the right mood. I just need to clear my head first. All reasonable, all believable, all justifications that let you move away without feeling like you're avoiding anything at all. And that's why this works so well. Because if it felt like sabotage, you would fight it. But it doesn't. It feels like you. Which means you follow it without resistance. That's the mechanism. Not a lack of discipline. Not a failure of character. A protection system designed to keep you from experiencing something your brain has decided is too costly. And once you see that clearly, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every time you've tried to fix this, you've aimed at the wrong target. You've tried to force the behavior. Push harder. Be stricter. Hold yourself accountable. And for a while, that works. Because in the short term, you can override the system. You can sit down and force yourself to act. You can ignore the resistance. You can push through the discomfort. But that effort is not free. It draws from something limited. Something that weakens with stress, with fatigue, with repetition. And the system you're fighting doesn't weaken. It waits. It doesn't need to win immediately. It only needs to outlast your ability to resist it. Which is why the pattern always returns. Not because you failed, but because you were using a tool that was never designed to solve this problem. You were trying to apply conscious effort to something that operates below conscious control. And no matter how strong that effort feels, in the moment it cannot sustain itself against a system that is automatic. This is where most people get stuck, because they interpret that failure the wrong way. They think, I wasn't disciplined enough. I didn't want it badly enough. I need to try harder next time. So they repeat the same approach with more intensity, more pressure, more self-judgment. And each time it collapses, the conclusion gets reinforced, until eventually they stop trying. Not because they don't care, but because they've convinced themselves that nothing they do will make a difference. And that belief becomes the final layer of the system, the part that keeps everything in place. Because if you believe the problem is who you are, you stop looking for how it works. And if you stop looking, you never see the structure that's been running your behavior this entire time. But now you're starting to see it. And once you see it, you can't interact with it the same way anymore. Because the moment you recognize that this isn't random, that it follows a pattern, that it has a function, you're no longer dealing with confusion. You're dealing with something you can actually understand. And once something can be understood, it can be changed. But not by forcing it, by working with the system instead of against it. And that starts with something most people skip entirely. Not action, not discipline, observation. Because before you can change a pattern, you have to see it clearly. Not the result, not the failure, the exact moment it begins. Because what you've been paying attention to is the end of the loop. The moment you gave in, the moment you stopped, the moment everything fell apart. That's the part that feels visible. That's the part that feels like the problem. But by the time you reach that point, the process is already in motion. The decision has already been made, quietly, automatically, without asking for your permission. Which means if you keep focusing on that moment, you will keep missing the only part of the process that actually matters. The beginning, the point where the pattern starts. Because every instance of what you call self-sabotage follows a structure, not a vague tendency, not a random impulse, a structure. And once you see that structure, the behavior stops feeling chaotic. It becomes predictable. There is always a trigger, something that happens right before the shift. Something so small, so familiar, you've learned to ignore it completely. It might be a moment of pressure, sitting down to begin something important, opening a blank page, looking at a task that actually matters. It might be a thought, a subtle one, easy to miss. Something like, this might not turn out well, or what if this isn't as good as it should be? It might be a feeling, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just enough tension to make you hesitate. And that's all it takes. Because the system doesn't need intensity, it needs recognition. The moment that trigger appears, the loop begins. And from that point forward, everything that follows feels natural. You don't experience it as a sequence. You experience it as a single decision. I just didn't feel like doing it. But that's not what happened. What happened is this. A trigger appeared. The system recognized it. And it loaded a response that has been reinforced over time. Repeated. Strengthened. Made more efficient with every cycle. And that response is what you experience as your choice. That's why it feels so convincing. Because by the time you're aware of it, it already feels like the most reasonable thing to do. That's the trap. Not that you're making bad decisions, but that you're inheriting them from a system that was built without your awareness. And once that system starts running, it doesn't need your agreement. It only needs the right conditions. That's why the same behavior shows up in the same situations. Not because you lack consistency, but because the environment is consistent. The same context, the same pressure, the same internal signals. And each time those elements align, the system executes the same response, effortlessly. This is where most people try to intervene. At the level of the behavior, they try to stop the scrolling, force the work, resist the distraction. But that's like trying to stop a chain reaction after it's already started. You're stepping in too late, because the behavior is not the cause, it's the result. And if you don't understand what triggered it, you can't change what follows. This is why the same strategies keep failing. You remove the distraction, it comes back. You block the app, you find another one. You force yourself to focus, you burn out, because you're trying to control the output without ever identifying the input. And the input is not always obvious. It's rarely as simple as "I felt bored" or "I didn't feel like it." Those are surface-level explanations. They describe the experience, not the mechanism. Underneath that, there is something more precise, a specific combination of factors that the system has learned to recognize as a signal, a location, a time, a mental state, a sequence of events. Individually, they mean nothing, but together they form a pattern. And that pattern is what activates the loop, which means if you want to change the outcome, you have to identify that pattern. Not once, not vaguely, repeatedly. You have to catch it in real time, the moment before the shift, not after, not when it's already too late, right at the edge. And that requires something most people avoid. Not effort, not discipline, attention. A kind of attention that doesn't judge, doesn't react, doesn't immediately try to fix, just observes. Because the moment you can see the trigger, clearly something changes. The behavior loses its invisibility. It stops feeling like part of you and starts feeling like something that's happening to you. And that distinction is where control begins. But seeing the trigger is only half of the system. Because even if you know what starts the loop, there's still a question that remains. Why does it keep running? What is it actually giving you that makes it so persistent? Because no behavior survives without a payoff. No pattern repeats itself for no reason. Which means if this keeps happening, if it keeps pulling you away at the same moments, if it keeps overriding your intentions, then it's delivering something. Something your brain has decided is worth keeping. And until you understand what that is, you will keep trying to replace the behavior with something that doesn't satisfy the system. And the system will reject it every time. Because if a pattern repeats, it's working. Not in the way you want, not in the way that moves your life forward, but in a way that serves a purpose. And that purpose is what keeps it alive. This is the part most people misunderstand. They look at the behavior and assume the reward is obvious. You scroll because it's entertaining. You avoid because it's easier. You delay because you're not in the mood. Those explanations feel right. They match the surface of the experience. But they don't explain why the pattern is so consistent. Because if the reward were that simple, you would replace it easily. You would choose something better, something more aligned, but you don't. And the reason you don't is because the real reward is not what it looks like. It's deeper, more specific, and far more important to the system than you realize. Take the moment right before you avoid something important. There's a feeling there, subtle, but unmistakable once you start paying attention. A kind of tension, not overwhelming. Not enough to stop you completely, just enough to make you hesitate. That tension is not random, it's the signal. The system recognizing that you're about to enter a situation where something is at stake, where you might be judged, where you might fail, where you might confirm something you don't want to believe about yourself. And in that moment, the brain does something very specific. It looks for relief, not success, not progress. Relief. Relief from the tension. Relief from the uncertainty. Relief from the possibility of finding out that you're not as capable as you think you are. And the behavior you call self-sabotage delivers that relief instantly. You step away, you delay, you distract yourself. And just like that, the tension disappears. Not because the situation changed, but because you removed yourself from it. That's the reward, not the scrolling, not the avoidance, the relief. And that's why the pattern is so difficult to break. Because you're not just dealing with a habit, you're dealing with a solution your brain has learned to use whenever that specific type of tension appears. Which means if you try to remove the behavior without replacing the relief, the system will reject it. Every time. You can force yourself for a while. You can push through the resistance. But the moment that tension comes back, the system will reach for the fastest path to relief. And that path is the one it already knows. This is why so many attempts at change fail. Not because the person didn't try. Not because they didn't care enough. But because they misunderstood what they were trying to change. They thought the problem was the behavior. So they attacked the behavior. They tried to remove it, suppress it, override it. But the behavior was never the core issue. It was the mechanism, the tool the brain was using to solve a deeper problem. And when you take away a solution without addressing the problem it solves, the system doesn't adapt. It resists. It looks for the old solution. It recreates the conditions. It pulls you back into the same pattern. Because from the brain's perspective, nothing better has been offered. That's the mistake. Replacing the behavior with something that doesn't deliver the same reward. Something that looks better on the surface, but fails to satisfy what the system is actually seeking. And when that happens, the new behavior never sticks. It feels forced, temporary, unnatural, while the old one feels automatic. Because it works, not for your long-term goals, but for your immediate state. And the brain prioritizes immediate state every time. Which means if you want to change the pattern, you don't start by asking, how do I stop this behavior? You start by asking, what is this behavior relieving? What tension disappears when it runs? What discomfort gets silenced? What risk gets avoided? Because once you can answer that the pattern stops being mysterious, it becomes logical. And once it becomes logical, you can work with it. Not by fighting it, not by suppressing it, but by giving the system a better way to get what it's already trying to get. A way that doesn't pull you away from your life every time something starts to matter. But before that becomes possible, there's something you have to understand. Something that makes this even more difficult than it appears. Because even when you see the pattern, even when you understand the trigger, even when you recognize the reward, there is still a part of you that will resist changing it. Not because it wants to hold you back, but because it doesn't trust what happens if you don't. Because from the outside, this looks simple. You see the pattern, you understand the trigger, you recognize the reward. So you should be able to change it. That's what most people assume. But the moment you try, something unexpected happens. Not resistance in the form you're used to. Not distraction. Not avoidance. Something quieter. Doubt. A subtle hesitation that doesn't feel like fear, but functions exactly like it. Because the system you're dealing with is not just protecting you from discomfort. It's protecting a version of you. A version that has been built over time. Reinforced by experience, strengthened by repetition. The version of you that says, this is how I operate, this is what I'm like, this is what I can handle. And every time you try to act outside of that, you create tension. Not just emotional tension, identity tension. Because if you change the behavior, you challenge the story. And if the story starts to break, something deeper becomes uncertain. Who are you without the patterns you've been repeating? That question is rarely conscious. You don't sit there and think it directly, but the system feels it. And when it feels that kind of instability, it responds the same way it always does, by pulling you back to what is known, even if what is known is what's keeping you stuck. This is why change feels so inconsistent, not because you lack effort, but because you're not just changing behavior, you're changing identity. And identity resists change more than almost anything else. Because identity creates stability, predictability, a sense of control, even if that stability comes at the cost of growth. So when you try to break a pattern, you're not just interrupting a habit, you're disrupting a system that has been organizing your behavior for years. And that system doesn't disappear just because you understand it. It remains, waiting. For the moment your attention drops, for the moment your energy is low, for the moment something feels uncertain again. And when that moment comes, it reactivates. Not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to feel familiar. And familiarity is one of the strongest forces in behavior, because the brain trusts what it recognizes, even when what it recognizes is exactly what you're trying to escape. This is why willpower keeps failing. Not because it doesn't work at all, but because it works temporarily. It allows you to override the system for a short period of time. You can force yourself to act differently. You can push through resistance. You can hold the new behavior in place. But that effort comes at a cost. It draws from a limited resource. Attention, energy, cognitive control. And those resources deplete across the day, across stress, across repeated use. And when they run low, the system you've been overriding becomes the default again. Not because it got stronger, but because you got tired. And the system never gets tired. It doesn't rely on effort. It doesn't require motivation. It runs automatically. Which means if your strategy depends entirely on willpower, you will always lose eventually. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because you're using something temporary to fight something permanent. And the longer that continues, the more it reinforces the same conclusion. That didn't work. I'm back where I started. Maybe this just isn't for me. And each time that thought appears, it strengthens the identity you've been trying to change, which makes the next attempt even harder, until eventually the effort stops. Not because you don't care, but because you've run out of ways to explain why it keeps happening. And when explanation fails, people default to identity. This is just who I am. That's where most people end, not because they reached a limit, but because they misunderstood the system they were dealing with. But you're not there anymore, because now you've seen it. The trigger, the response, the reward, the identity layer holding it all together. Which means the question is no longer, why does this keep happening? The question is, what do I do with this now? And the answer is not what most people expect. Because it doesn't start with forcing new behavior. It starts with something much more precise. Something that changes how the entire system responds without relying on willpower at all. Because if willpower isn't the solution, then what is? Not more effort. Not more pressure. Not another version of the same strategy that already failed. Something else. Something more precise. Because once you understand that the system is built on a loop, you stop trying to break it, and you start learning how to redesign it. Not all at once, not dramatically, at one specific point. The only point that actually matters. The moment the system expects a response, because every loop follows the same structure. A trigger appears, a routine follows, a reward is delivered. You've been trying to eliminate the routine. That's why it keeps coming back. Because the system doesn't care about the routine. It cares about the reward. And as long as the reward remains necessary, the loop will persist. So the strategy changes. You stop trying to remove the behavior. And you start asking what can replace it that gives the same result. Not something better in theory. Not something that aligns with your long-term goals. Something that works in the moment. Because that's the only time the system listens. This is where most attempts fail. People choose replacements that make sense logically, but don't satisfy the system emotionally. They try to replace distraction with discipline, avoidance with effort, and the system rejects it. Because from its perspective, nothing has improved. The tension is still there. The uncertainty is still there. The risk is still there. So it goes back to what works, which means the replacement has to be specific, not vague, not general. Precise enough that the system can recognize it as a viable alternative, and immediate enough that it delivers the reward without delay. That's the key. Because the brain does not wait for long-term benefits. It chooses what reduces tension now. So instead of saying, I'll just focus, you define something concrete. When I feel the urge to avoid starting, I will do this specific action. Not because it's perfect, but because it interrupts the loop at the exact point it begins. And that interruption does something important. It creates a gap, a small one, but enough. Enough to prevent the automatic response from completing. Enough to give you a different path, not through force, but through structure. This is where change actually starts. Not in motivation, not in intensity, in design. You design the response before the moment arrives, so that when the trigger appears, you don't have to think. Because thinking is too slow. The system is already running by then. You replace it with something just as automatic, something that delivers a similar reward without pulling you away. And at the same time, you change the environment, not in extreme ways, in small, deliberate adjustments. Because the system follows the path of least resistance, always. So you make the old path harder, Not impossible, just inconvenient enough. And you make the new path easier, accessible, visible, ready. So when the moment comes, the system doesn't have to choose. It defaults. And if you've designed it correctly, it defaults in your favor. This is not about becoming stronger. It's about making the behavior easier. Because the brain doesn't reward effort. It rewards efficiency. And when the new pattern becomes more efficient than the old one, it starts to replace it. Slowly, not instantly. Because the old pattern doesn't disappear. It remains. Stored. Waiting. But each time the new response runs, it strengthens. And each time the old one is bypassed, it weakens. Not erased, just less dominant. And over time, the system shifts. Not because you forced it, but because you gave it a better option. That's how the loop changes. Not by fighting it, by rewriting it. And once you understand that something else becomes clear, the problem was never that you couldn't change. It was that you were trying to change without understanding what you were changing. And that misunderstanding is what kept the pattern alive. But now that's no longer the case. Because now you've seen the structure. And once you see the structure, you can't go back to seeing it as chaos. You can't go back to calling it laziness. You can't go back to believing that this is just who you are. Because it isn't. It never was. Because if this really was just who you are, there would be no pattern. There would be no specific moments where it appears. No consistent triggers. No predictable loop. It would be random. But it isn't. It's structured. And anything structured can be understood. And anything understood can be changed. But not all at once. Not in the way most people expect. Because change at this level doesn't feel dramatic. It feels subtle. Almost unnoticeable at first. You catch the moment a second earlier. You notice the tension before it turns into action. You pause where before you would have moved automatically. And that pause is everything. Because for the first time, you're not inside the loop. You're watching it. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not a perfect choice. Not an easy one. But a real one. Do you follow the pattern or do you interrupt it? That's where the shift begins. Not when everything changes, but when something small happens differently. And that difference starts to compound because the system learns, not from intention, not from what you say you'll do, from what you actually repeat. So every time you interrupt the pattern, even once you introduce something new, a new response, a new pathway, a new possibility. And the more that gets repeated, the more it becomes familiar. And familiarity is what the brain trusts. Which means over time, the thing that once felt difficult starts to feel normal. Not because it got easier, but because it got known. And the thing that used to feel automatic starts to feel optional. That's the shift. Not from bad to perfect, from automatic to aware, from unaware patterns to intentional ones. And once that happens, everything changes. Not instantly, but permanently. Because you're no longer reacting blindly. You're participating in the process. You see the trigger. You understand the response. You recognize the reward. And you decide what happens next. Not perfectly, but consciously. And that's the difference. Because self-sabotage only works when it's invisible, when it feels like you, when it goes unquestioned. But once you see it for what it is, a system, a pattern, a learned response, it loses that power. Not completely, but enough. Enough for you to step in. Enough for you to interrupt it. Enough for you to choose differently. And that's all you need. Not perfection, just interruption, just awareness, just enough space to stop repeating something you never chose in the first place. So the next time it happens, don't rush to fix it. Don't immediately try to force yourself forward. Just watch. Notice the moment the shift begins. Notice the thought, the feeling, the hesitation. And ask yourself one question. What is this trying to protect me from? Not the behavior, the reason behind it. Because the moment you see that clearly, you stop fighting yourself and you start understanding yourself. And that's where real change begins. Not in effort, but in awareness. If this made something clearer for you then, you're already further than you were before. Not because everything has changed, but because now you can see what was always there. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you reach that point, something else becomes clear. This was never about motivation. Not really. Because motivation assumes one thing, that you weren't acting because you didn't want to. But that was never true. You wanted it. You thought about it, planned it. Imagined what your life would look like if you followed through. The desire was there. What wasn't there was alignment. Because part of you wanted to move forward, and another part was trying to keep you exactly where you were, not out of weakness, out of protection. And when those two forces collide, the stronger one wins. Not the one that wants more, the one that feels safer. That's the rule, always. Which means if growth feels unsafe, you will resist it. Even if you consciously want it, even if it makes logical sense, even if you know it's the right thing to do. Because logic does not override perception. And if your system perceives risk, it will act accordingly. That's why everything changes the moment you stop asking, how do I force myself to act? And start asking, how do I make this feel safe enough to begin? Not perfectly safe, just enough. Enough that the system doesn't trigger the same level of resistance. Enough that the tension doesn't spike the moment you start. Because when the tension is lower, the need for relief is lower. And when the need for relief is lower, the pattern weakens. This is where real strategy begins. Not in intensity, in calibration. You reduce the scale. You stop trying to do everything at once, and you focus on the smallest version of the action that still moves you forward. Not because it's impressive, but because it's sustainable. Because the system doesn't resist small steps the way it resists big ones. A massive change feels threatening. A small one barely registers. So you use that. You don't try to prove anything. You don't try to validate your identity. You just act at a level the system accepts. And then you repeat it. Not occasionally, consistently. Because repetition is what rewrites the pattern. Not intensity. Not bursts of motivation. Consistency. The same action, in the same context, over and over again, until it becomes familiar. And once it becomes familiar, the system stops treating it as a threat. It stops activating the same response. And that's when something interesting happens. The resistance that used to feel automatic starts to fade. Not completely, but enough that it no longer controls the outcome. Enough that you can move forward without feeling like you're fighting yourself every step of the way. And that's the difference, not between failure and success, but between conflict and alignment. Because when the system is aligned, you don't need to force anything. You act, not because you're pushing yourself, but because nothing is pulling you back. And that's what most people are actually trying to reach. Not more discipline, less resistance. Because once resistance drops, action becomes natural. Not easy, but possible. Consistently possible. And from that point, everything builds. Not instantly, but steadily. Because now the system is working with you instead of against you. And that changes what's possible over time. Not in one moment, but across many. Small decisions, repeated, compounded. Until the pattern that once held you in place is no longer the default. And the version of you that felt out of reach becomes normal. Not because you forced it into existence, but because you removed what was preventing it. That's the shift. And once you understand that there's nothing left to wait for, no perfect moment, no sudden breakthrough, just the next time the pattern begins and what you choose to do with it. Because now you can see it. And once you can see it, you have a responsibility. Not to be perfect, but to stop pretending that you don't understand what's happening anymore. Because you do. And that changes everything. So the next time you hesitate, don't rush to escape it. Don't immediately distract yourself. Stay there, just long enough to see what your mind is trying to do. And ask yourself, do I follow this or do I interrupt it? Because that moment is where your life starts to change. Not all at once, but in a way that finally lasts.